Hi, my name is Manish Gupta, and in this video, I'm going to talk about question generation for videos, and specifically generation of entity-centric information-seeking questions from videos. Okay. This is the work that we did recently with my student Arpan and Professor Asif Iqbal. So this work is in collaboration with IIT Patna folks. Okay. So let me get started. This work was also recently presented at EMNLP 2024. Okay. So let me get started by first talking about what is question generation and why is it important. Okay. So the task of question generation is basically, I'm giving you some input. Typically, the input could be a text paragraph or it could be a video, and I want you to generate some interesting question out of it, right? So this is basically somewhat reverse of a task of question answering. So, where given some passage or a video and a question, you want to generate an answer. In question generation, several times, you're given the passage, and sometimes you're also given the answer, by the way, and then you're asked to generate a question. In this particular work, we are basically just given the video and we want to generate a question out of it, right? Now, video question generation is super interesting because it can be used for several applications. Like in education domain, it can be used for creating interactive learning material, exams, quizzes, interview questions, clarification questions, study aid for students, and so on. For customer support, of course, question generation is important because it can help generate frequently asked question, those kinds of pages, which can help train better chatbots later, right? It can also be in general used for generating thought-provoking questions, which can be useful for research, surveys, and interview protocol, establishing interview protocols. Okay. So, and in this work, basically, rather than just doing typical text-based question generation, we are going to do video-based question generation, which means our input is a video, and we basically want to show, we want to basically generate questions out of those videos. Okay. So for example, and by the way, this is also useful in search engines, where search engines actually show these kinds of modules called as people also ask or related question answers, right? Related Q&A, where let's say if the user basically just searched for cryptocurrency, they can be shown this kind of a module where sometimes these questions just have text-based answers, but sometimes there could be questions which basically have a video as an answer where the user can actually click on the video and view a particular segment or the clip of the video to get the answer, right? How to start investing in cryptocurrencies. Similarly, so this is a snapshot from the Bing, the top one, and the bottom one is a snapshot from Google, where the typical people also ask block actually has several questions. And if you click on some of those questions, how do you start and open a Tesla? You can actually see a video with a particular clip highlighted as well, where the answer is. Okay. So we want to do basically, these two things in some ways. We want to take a video, generate questions of this kind, and then also link those questions to what part of the video basically contains the answer. Okay. So what is new in this work that we did in this ECIS-VQG? So VQG is what I talked about, visual question generation or video question generation. But what is new? What is this ECIS thing in this ECIS-VQG in our paper compared to existing VQG? Okay. So the existing question generation methods basically generate questions from transcripts only. So visual information processing is complicated. So rather than generating from videos, they basically just look at the transcripts and then they generate questions based on those, text-based question generation methods where the text is transcripts. They also generate questions about common objects and attributes rather than specific questions, entity seeking questions like this. How do you open and start a Tesla now? Or how do you start investing in cryptocurrencies? Rather than these particular entities or nouns, they basically focus more on common objects and attributes. For example, they can generate questions like, what did the person get a plastic bowl from? Which is basically very, very contextually sensitive based on the video content, right? It's basically not a generic question that can be shown in a people also ask block in these search engines, right? It's a very, very common kind of a question containing common objects and attributes. What will I show you? Now, I mean, that's not basically a question which can be linked to a particular query and can be shown in a people also ask block in a search on a search engine. Okay. Or the nationality of the celebrity is highlighted in the last 1/3 of the video. This is another work that I did with with another student. Again, as you see in this work, we are really focused on generating questions which are contextually sensitive to the video. Right? So we want to generate standalone questions. They should basically be good questions that have a meaning by themselves, and they should be entity focused. They should be focused on some entity. Generate questions related to entities which are of course related to the video as well, so which are basically being described in the video. Now, in this work, which I did here earlier, we were basically using templates to generate these kinds of questions. So question generation templates, as we would call them. Um, Now, question generation templates are interesting, but they can actually lead to very bland questions. So, for example, they can lead to questions like how to make some dish, right? But how about coming up with very interesting questions like this? How to add the holy trinity, chopped onion, bell pepper, and celery in seafood combo? It's very complicated to generate creative questions like this if you're just using templates. So another reason for not using templates is that they are inefficient. If you are working in a particular domain, you can use templates of a particular domain. But if you change the domain, then you have to basically custom tailor these templates for generating questions in that domain. Okay. If you look at it on the right side, basically here is a video. Of course, there's a link to the video as well. You can click there or other, look at it later. So the interesting part is that I'll basically show you what the current models generate and what we want to generate, right? The current models generate a question like this: is the food really cheap? So this video is about some guy, some tourist guy going to some places and then trying testing food here and there. Okay, but our model generates a very interesting question: what is special about outdoor dining area at Khajagar, right? Now, of course, this question is standalone, good by itself. And we can then link it to this video and say, oh, this video also answers it. But there could be other videos, other web pages which could answer it as well, right? So, but if you look at this, is the food really cheap? Now, this is not a standalone question by itself. There's no entity-centric behavior here, right? That's that. Similarly, if you look at this video is basically about some chair and armrest and some review about this chair. Now, the question is, what are the pros and cons of the chair? Now, which chair, right? By itself, this question is not standalone. It doesn't stand by itself, right? It's okay. It's contextually sensitive to the video, but it's not a complete question by itself, self-complete, right? But this question is self-complete. How is the armrest in gaming chair IM19, right? And then, yes, you can say that, well, this video actually helps you answer that. That's great. But that's the difference between standard QG methods, standard video question generation methods versus our method, ECIS-VQG, which basically generates self-complete entity-centric questions, information-seeking questions. Okay. So that's that. To be able to do this entity-centric information-seeking video question generation, we leverage a very interesting concept of chapter titles. Okay. So interestingly, on YouTube, when you see the videos, there's also flexibility or a possibility of people marking chapters on them. So people can the people who upload these videos, they can basically mention that, hey, from this second to this second is one chapter and then another chapter and so on. Chapters are like segments or clips in the video. Okay. So the interesting part is that we can actually use these chapter titles. People also give titles to those chapters. So we can use these chapter titles to generate questions. And that's what we do in this work. Now, the challenge, although, is that you cannot really directly use these. It's not trivial to just use chapter titles to generate questions. Okay, not all chapter titles are question worthy. So, for example, there'll be chapter titles like intro and conclusion and so on. Now, you can't generate interesting questions out of those chapter titles. Chapter titles also directly cannot be used as questions. I'll show you more examples later why you cannot really directly use those chapter titles as questions themselves. Okay. So what we do is to basically the first step is to basically prompt these models like Alpaca, Qwen, GPT 3.5 Turbo, GPT 4.0, and tell them basically, hey, here is the chapter title. Can you give me a reasonable question out of this chapter title? Okay. Now, it turns out it's not easy. We basically observe that it basically leads to very poor results unless we actually train our own models and fine tune them on some labeled data, which basically tells the model how to take a chapter title and convert it into a ECIS-VQG, right? ECIS video question, a useful question, ECIS question, right? Entity-centric information seeking question. Okay. So now to fine tune these kinds of models, T5 base or BART large model, both of them which are 12 encoder layer and 12 decoder layer kind of models, it's sort of important for us to generate labeled data so that we can fine tune these models. And therefore we basically curate a data set called as video questions to begin with. So what is video questions data? Well, to generate this data, we start with 50,000 YouTube videos, right? And we filter from this set of YouTube videos a lot. So basically retain only those videos which are less than 10 minutes because of compute power requirements, and also which have English transcript. We are focusing on English questions in this work. Okay. We also retain videos of these categories: education, entertainment, how to and style, news, politics, science, people, science and technology, travel and events, because these categories actually contain a whole bunch of entity-centric information in them, right? And then we generate this data set where each sample actually contains the original video, of course. It also contains chapter titles with their start and end timestamps. It contains timestamps transcripts. YouTube also makes those transcripts publicly available, so we use those. We also have video titles from the metadata. So we also take the video title and the description that is available as part of the video metadata from the YouTube API. Okay. So overall, the dataset basically finally, after all of this cleanup and so on, contains 411 videos with the 2,789 chapter titles. Okay. And of course, these are chapter titles obtained from the YouTube API itself, right? Such that videos are about 6 minutes in length on average, and each chapter is about 48 seconds in length on average. Okay. Now, once we have these, as I mentioned, chapter titles are not enough by themselves. So some chapter titles, in fact, are useless. You cannot really create questions out of them. Some chapter titles are really questions by themselves, so they're really awesome, right? So therefore, what we want to do is to first label these questions in the video questions data set, depending on what is the kind of chapter title. So the chapter title is of 4 different types, possibly. So, and this is all manually labeled, by the way. So we basically, Arpan, along with the other annotators, actually labeled this data set. So what he did was to basically take these chapter titles and essentially come up with labels, one of these 4. So it could be a useless chapter title, meaning intro or conclusion or like, share, subscribe kind of things, which basically are not, they cannot lead to any interesting any interesting question, right? While some of these questions are basically self-complete, some of the chapter titles are self-complete questions by themselves, like what is a wormhole, right? Now, you don't really need to process it through any model to create a question. It's a good question by itself, okay? Two other types are these, which are not self-complete questions. For example, where was she born? Now, where was she born is very, very contextually sensitive to the title of the video, right? So maybe the title of the video is Elizabeth Turner. And if I can actually combine the title of the video with where was she born, I can actually potentially come up with this nice chapter, nice question. When was the LA model Elizabeth Turner born, right? So those are not self-complete questions. And similarly, there are also not self-complete phrases like gives you online visibility or aerial routes. And you can combine it with some parts of the transcript or the video title or video description or any other context so as to basically come up with a nice question by itself. Okay. So that's that. And in our data set, basically after labeling, we observed that there are 524 useless chapter titles, 133, not self-complete questions, 189 self-complete questions, and 1,943, not self-complete phrases. Okay, so that's basically that. And there were others which basically there was no consensus about the chapter titles and therefore they were thrown out. So overall, out of the data set which had 2,789 chapter titles, we finally landed up with 2,265 chapter titles with that distribution. So we have some labeled data. Okay. We use this labeled data, by the way, to train a classifier, and I'll talk about that classifier on the next slide, how good that BERT-based classifier perform. But we trained a classifier so as to take a chapter title and classify it in any of these types at test time. Okay. Now, further, basically for every question, we also got annotations done. So essentially, in some cases, the idea was that they were not so basically in these cases, right, not self-complete questions and not self-complete phrases, what we asked the annotators to do was to basically take the chapter titles and come up with a reasonable question. Okay. So when they were coming up with reasonable question, we asked them to follow some basic guidelines, specifically these 3 guidelines. Questions should be broadly related to the existing chapter title and not unrelated. Of course, they have to do something with chapter title, right? Ensure that the questions are engaging, information seeking, focused on real world entities, and directly related to video chapter content. Of course, it has to be related to the content of the chapter by itself, right? Avoid questions that need extra context, right? We told them specifically, don't basically leverage any extra knowledge or context that you have or reference topics beyond the chapter or use relative time references like the current US president, because otherwise the chapter, the information becomes stale. And if information becomes stale, we can't really show it on Bing or Google in those PA kind of interfaces, right? So that's that. So basically, this is how the data was annotated. And overall, we have so many samples, 2,265 samples, where we actually know what is the question type. And also, if the question type is basically not self-complete questions or not self-complete phrases, then we have a proper question associated or labeled for it in that sense. Okay. Now, of course, this is video question generation. So we also want to process videos. So what we did was to basically obtain frame captions. So we basically sampled 1 frame per second from the chapter clip. So we took a chapter clip. So with so many samples, we actually also have a video clip associated. Okay, so we sampled 1 frame per second. And for each frame, we use the pre-trained blip as well as clip clap model so as to essentially obtain captions from them. For a particular chapter clip, we have multiple frames. So therefore, we'll have multiple captions. We concatenate all of those frame captions corresponding to the same chapter. Okay. Now we observed that sometimes these captions are pretty noisy. Okay, so frame captions and transcript, even the transcript associated with them is pretty noisy from YouTube. Okay, so therefore what we did was to pass these frame captions and transcripts to GPT 3.5 Turbo and ask it to create summaries. So summaries actually help us do two things. One, it actually reduces the overall size of the frame captions and transcripts. And second, also cleans up the noise. So both of them are good things. And that is why I basically use GPT 3.5 Turbo so as to get cleaned visual representation in some way in text form, in a nice summarized form. Okay. So overall, across these 2,265 samples, we have the following lengths. Chapter title is about 4.6 words. Video title is about 10.3 words. So video titles are typically longer, so compared to chapter titles. We have transcripts which are very long, 132 words, and we also have frame captions which are about 173 words. Okay, and these are basically all the lengths per chapter. So for every chapter, for every chapter, these are the lengths that you have. Okay. So now how does our system work? So remember, our system basically takes a video, okay, gets a chapter out of it, and from every chapter, it's basically going to generate some question. Okay, so that's basically the system. ECIS-VQG, what is the system? Well, broadly, it is a video question generation system, but our system works only if the video actually has chapters marked in it. So what do? We take each chapter and we run the entire system that you see here so as to be able to generate a question. Okay. Now, as you see, this particular architecture diagram shows you how do we do the training for the system. Okay, how do we do the training for the system? The orange colored boxes basically are inputs, right? The blue colored boxes are models that we use, and the green colored box right here is the generated question. So that's the output basically. Okay. The pink colored things here are the losses. So let me go over it step by step, right? So what are the inputs? So input is a chapter, remember? So now the chapter has a title, so that's the text input. The chapter also is a video, so there's the chapter video. And we can actually pass the chapter video through a clip or a ResNext model so as to get a chapter video embedding. So there's a video embedding that you have. Okay. Similarly, the chapter has, as I mentioned on the previous slide, we basically pass it through blip or clip clap so as to basically get these frame captions for different frames. And that basically gives us captions. We, of course, pass it through GPT 3.5 Turbo, as I mentioned on the previous slide, so as to get a good summary. Okay. We, of course, pass the frame captions also by itself in case we are using Alpaca and Alpaca kind of a model, which is prompt engineering kind of model. But in case of T5 and BART, we basically just pass the summary because T5 and BART really cannot process very long input sequences. Okay. Of course, as I also mentioned in the previous slide, we take the chapter transcript and pass it through GPT 3.5 to get a good summary. Okay. So video also is a title that is also passed as input to our T5 or BART model so as to basically generate a question. So T5 and BART are encoder decoder models, and they can basically generate, therefore, the question at the decoder side. Okay. Of course, we could also use Alpaca to generate a question, in which case, basically, we just need to prompt the model. We don't really fine tune Alpaca. We basically just use it in a zero shot form, okay, and basically generate question out of Alpaca. Okay. In the paper, we also show results, by the way, with the GPT-4o and GPT 3.5 Turbo. So, we just don't restrict ourselves to Alpaca. Okay. Now, of course, we don't generate questions from every chapter. Remember, useless chapters, we don't generate questions based out of them. So therefore, there needs to be a BERT-based classifier, which takes the chapter title and tells you whether it is a useless question or not. So if it's a useless question, we discard. We basically stop here. We cannot generate a question out of this chapter. Okay. If it's a self-complete question, the title is itself a self-complete question. Again, we really do not need, the T5 or a BART model. We directly have a generated question right here. So if it's a self-complete question, great. We don't really need to do anything. Stop here. Okay. But if it is a not a question and not useless, basically it's a non-self-complete question or a phrase, we basically give it we basically pass it on to T5 or BART models just to generate a question. the generated question at train time is compared with the gold question, so as to essentially compute the cross-entropy loss, the standard cross-entropy loss, right? One other thing that we want to do is to generate a question which is not a usual question with common objects and attributes. Okay, so therefore, what we do is to basically compare is to take the same chapter title and ask a traditional question generation model along with video title, so to generate a non-ECIS question. Okay, a question with the common names of objects and attributes. Okay. And what we want to do is to generate a ECIS question, which is far away from that non-ECIS question. So we don't want to generate questions like, oh, what does this video show? Or what is this person doing in this video, right? Things of that kind we don't want to basically generate. And therefore, what we want to do is to generate questions such that they are as far away from those non-ECIS questions. So therefore, we also define a contrastive loss, which takes the which favors generation of those questions which are as far away from the non-ECIS questions. Okay, our overall loss is basically a combination of this cross-entropy loss and the contrastive loss. And that's what we basically use to train the T5 and the BART model. Okay. Now, one thing that I did not mention is that this T5 or BART model, of course, gets all the text information from these arrows, but also gets the video information from the video embedding. And the way this happens is through this cross-attention transformer encoder layers. Okay. So in this T5 or the BART model, the encoder layers, the 12 encoder layers have been modified so as to have cross-attention, where the keys and the values come from cross-attention sublayer as well, where the keys and the values basically come from the chapter video encoding, embedding, and the queries basically are coming from our text side. The queries come from the text side. Okay, so the cross attention basically helps this merger of the video and the text information, so that the T5 model or the BART model nicely generates outputs, by considering both the chapter text information and the chapter video information together. Of course, Alpaca cannot be modified to have cross attention, but we could modify our T5 and BART so as to have cross attention layers in the encoder side, so that they can generate questions which are sensitive both to the text and the video content of the input chapter. Okay. So now this particular module that you see here, the chapter title classifier or the BERT-based classifier model these are the metrics for the BERT-based classifier model. As you can observe, it basically has a pretty good precision for the non-self-complete phrases. For useless questions, well, the recall is 1, which is very important because you don't really want to generate questions from useless questions, right? Or generate questions from useless chapter titles. Okay, so therefore we try to tune the thresholds of this classifier such that for useless questions we basically have a very high recall, which basically means we don't really generate stuff from. Which basically means that we ignore the useless questions as much as possible, right? Of course, this also means that we end up having a low precision, which means that some of those chapter titles which could have led to reasonable questions, they are discarded, unfortunately, but that's how it is, right? Self-complete questions basically have precision recall. About F1 is about 0.68. Clearly, there's a lot of room for improvement here. But remember, this is the first work in terms of coming up with this kind of a framework to generate questions automatically, right? So overall, if you consider the overall macro accuracy, well, that's basically 0.93, and micro accuracy is 0.93, and the macro averages are 0.65. Basically, that's that. Okay, we have a very good F1, as you can notice, for the non-self-complete phrases, which are the ones which we really want to target and generate good questions from. Okay, so how are our ECIS-VQG models trained? So as you can see, this is basically the distribution of the input data. So for every chapter, we have a chapter title, we have frame captions, we have video title that also goes as input to T5 and BART models to generate good good questions. We have the transcript, and we have a duration of those chapter videos, right? And as you can observe, all of them follow power law curve, right? So on the y-axis, basically we show length or duration. Depending on whether it is these things or the duration part. So duration is in seconds, length is in words. And as you can see, the data set is pretty good because it follows a power law, and most real world data sets follow reasonable power laws. Okay, so that's that. Now, all of our T5 and BERT models, their encoder layers basically have video embedding as keys and values for cross attention, and they basically use the text part of the things for the queries themselves. Cross attention, transformer layer, and video embedding, of course, are not applicable to Alpaca because we don't train it in that sense. Losses, we basically, as I mentioned on the previous slide, we use two losses: contrastive loss with non-ECIS questions and cross-entropy loss with the ground truth ECIS question. Okay. Non-ECIS question generation could actually also sometimes lead to ECIS questions. Now, you see, when we basically use traditional question generation modules to basically generate non-ECIS question, sometimes it could happen that could generate an ECIS question. So defining contrastive loss with respect to an ECIS question is a bad idea. And therefore, what we do is to further clean up, ensure that the question that is generated by this model, the traditional QG model, is a non-ECIS question by checking if it contains entities or not. So we use a standard BERT-based NER model so as to just pick those questions which have no entities. So questions which have entities, we discard them, and we try to sample again from the traditional QG model to basically be able to get a question with no entities, such that we are properly sure that this model is basically generating a non-ECIS question. Okay. So here are some examples of what does our model generate and what does a traditional question generation model generate. So this is a chapter about branch cutting with roots, and the video title is how to take cuttings of arrowhead plant. Now the non-ECIS question is what will we do with the roots of the plant? Now, yeah, again, this requires a lot of context to understand what will we do with the roots of a plant. But if you actually look at the ECIS generated question, do you have to cut the branch from the root of synogium cuttings? Okay, it's a pretty self-complete question by itself. Okay. Similarly, if you look at yet another example, two groups of members is the chapter title. Our mighty network adventure begins. This inside story of building a thriving online community. And the ECIS question is what kind of groups does the Creative Life Center support? And that's a pretty Creative Life Center seems like an organization which supports certain kinds of groups. It's a pretty self-complete question versus this basically is pretty context sensitive. What is the name of the new online community? And well, there could be so many names. It requires a lot of context to be able to answer this, right? So we also basically generate ECIS questions using prompt engineering. So using Alpaca or GPT 3.5 Turbo or GPT-4. So for prompt engineering, we basically use this prompt. So as you can see, it's a long prompt. Basically, we give it as input the transcript of that chapter. We give the frame captions also, and we give the chapter title and video title. We try to do whatever we could for prompt engineering, give all the context so as to tell it, hey, take this chapter title and finally generate a good question. We also told it what a good question is. So the question must be, should not contain any kind of pronouns. It should basically, a generic question must be in the chapter title or the transcript. It should be engaging, information seeking, lengthy, and centered around some real world entity. We told it to generate an ECIS question. Okay. In fact, we also basically experimented by giving it positive exemplars. So basically said the generate questions should be like these. These are positive examples of what ECIS questions are. We also give it negative examples saying that, hey, do not generate questions like these. What is the name of this place? Where do I need to take cuttings and so on? I mean, questions that basically contain pronouns or they are not self-complete by themselves, right? So we did few short prompt engineering where we gave positive examples and negative examples. We gave very good task description. We gave all the context we could. And then how do the results look like? So let's look at the results. Okay. So we measured results using standard natural language generation matrix. So BLEU, CIDEr, METEOR, distinct matrix, BERT score, and ROUGE, right? Higher the values, the better it is, right? For everything. Okay. And we show results across several kinds of methods. We tried with the standard question generation methods in block A. Okay. We also tried with the prompt engineering methods in block B. We basically show results with our T5 model in block C. We show results using the BERT model in block D. And lastly, block E essentially is our best model where we also use the clip-based video embeddings. So with the cross attention thing and so on, right? For all the other models, A, B, C, D, basically we cannot use clip embeddings, but we still use video information. For example, here we basically use video captions and so on. So chapter captions, and we also basically pass those frame captions and so on in these models in the BERT and BART models in block C and D. Okay. Now, of course, block C and D actually contain lots of short forms. So basically, let me tell you, the subscript C basically means that we just used the cross-entropy loss, but subscript double C basically means we used both the losses, cross-entropy loss and the contrastive loss. Okay. Now in the brackets, there is the CV, FT, and S. So what does that mean? C basically stands for chapter title, V for video title, F for frame caption, T for transcript, and S is basically summary of the frame captions and transcript. Basically, that's that. Okay. Now, as you can observe, standard, of course, you can look at any of the metrics, but if you look at BLEU 1, right, let's look at this. Standard question generation models basically lead to very small scores, right? Basically in single digit, basically, right? While our best model gives you 71.3, that's a huge, huge difference, right? Standard essentially prompt engineering models lead to good scores, 22.4, but not as good as our model clearly, right? So fine tuning helps. That's the broad idea. Okay. Otherwise, if you just use Alpaca, QN, any of these prompt engineering based methods, they don't work out of the box. So we also observed that if you basically supply all of these frame captions and essentially transcripts and so on, that leads to very good accuracies. You can actually get very good accuracies with the T5 and part models without giving video embeddings. But giving video embeddings leads to even better improvements, right? So it basically leads to improvements, giving the best of the scores in most cases. So in ROUGE, in CIDEr, in BLEU, all of those basically lead to the best results. Of course, if you do not give video embeddings, you still get reasonable results, especially good results in METEOR and BERT score. But the idea is that the BART model, specifically when provided the chapter title, video title, and a summary of frame captions and transcripts leads to the best results. Video embeddings you may provide, you may not provide, you still get good results. But the other four things, the chapter title, video title, and the summary of the frame captions and transcript is a must. Okay. Here are some examples generated by our ECIS questions generator, the best model, basically. You can sort of pause to read through these various examples, but I can basically just show you some examples. So for example, there's a Samsung Galaxy phones being compared, and there's a chapter title is display. Now, this is of course not a self-complete title, but we generate really good self-complete titles like how does the display of Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 5 look? Okay, so this is good. And then similarly, you can basically look at another example, 2 ways to grow, not a good one, but what are 2 ways to grow your consulting business? And yes, the video basically seems to be about consulting business. That's a great title. That's a great question generated, right? And of course, there are gold questions also. So the gold question here is, of course, talking about other phones as well, but well, we were able to at least identify one phone. And that's a reasonably good question to be showing in the people also ask kind of blocks. Okay. So we also tried to do human evaluation of the best model and ask people 3 interesting questions, 3 different factors on which they can evaluate these automatically generated questions: contextual relevance, engagement index, and fluency. So we told humans to evaluate the predicted or the generated questions from various models and give a score between 0 to 4 on these 3 different rubrics, 3 different metrics, right? So context relevance basically means how much does the question align with the content of the corresponding video chapter. Engagement index basically means what is the level of engagement and the interest in this question. Is it an interesting question or not, right? Third one is fluency. Is the question grammatically correct or not, right? So as expected, typically the fluency scores are good. These days, the models are pretty good in terms of fluency generation. So overall, if you look at our best model, generates 4 on 5. I mean, it basically gets a score of 3.99 on 4. The scale is from 0 to 4. Okay. And essentially, even on engagement and contextual relevance, we basically get pretty good scores, basically saying that these questions that are being generated are directly practically usable, right? So here is an example to show how our best model compares with these prompt engineering based models, Qwen and GPT-4. Okay. So the gold question is how to, this is a video and a chapter, I'm not mentioned the video and chapter here, but the gold question is how to create a house wholesaling checklist, and our model really generates that stuff. But what is interesting to note is that GPT-4o basically generates things like promoted by the man in a red shirt. Now that's really bad. How can you show that on a people also ask block, right? People also ask block, typically want to show self-complete questions, not referring to a particular video, but this one basically ends up generating things of that kind. Or, how does the person prepare the sausage gravy in the video? Not self-complete. It is contextually relevant, contextually very, very tied to that video, right? It's not a self-complete question, which is entity-centric in that sense. But it's a pretty good question that we generate how to make the sausage gravy for buttermilk substitute. Okay. Okay, so of course our model is not perfect, so it makes errors. We took 100 generated questions and tried to figure out errors, the kind of errors it makes. We found that it makes 4 different types of errors. It can sometimes generate questions with hallucinations, sometimes make grammatically incorrect questions. It can sometimes also generate ambiguous questions or questions missing, important keywords that are there in chapter title. Okay, so for example, if the chapter title is adding mobile device to the network, it can actually basically, it can be talking about a particular kind of a mobile device, but our generated question is basically how to add a mobile device to the network, while what we expect is that in this particular video, it's talking about a brother machine, which is not basically mentioned in this question that is generated by our model. So it basically is missing, it's an ambiguous question, sort of a more generic question, missing important keywords like brother machine in the question. Okay. Sometimes we can also end up generating contextually incongruous questions, not related to the topic of the chapter at all. So, for example, well, I mean, I've probably not shown a good example. Or maybe, yeah, I mean, so the chapter title could be I cannot be burned in fire or drowned in water. These are riddles, basically, right? And basically, we are generating a question like, can you be burnt in fire or drowned in water? Now, this is a completely odd question to be asked, right? People also ask kind of a block. And but that's a question that gets generated, unfortunately, by our model, possibly because of wrong classification, right? In general, this chapter title is probably not a very good chapter. I mean, the video is not a really very good video to basically generate information seeking entity-centric questions in that sense. But well, I mean, our model does basically generate these kinds of errors, and it generates more of these hallucination errors and less of these grammatically incorrect questions. I mean, these days models don't generate grammar errors that much, but sometimes it does generate these hallucinations. Okay. Okay, so in summary, in this video, I talked about the novel problem of generating questions from videos and generating questions which are entity-centric and information seeking. Right? I talked about how we curated a novel data set called VIDEOQUESTIONS, which contains 411 videos and 2,000 plus manually annotated questions. Okay. And lastly, I talked about a system which basically consumes rich text and visual signals from these video chapters and generates entity-centric information seeking questions from these video chapters. Okay, that's it for this video. Hope you liked the video. Thank you for watching. Connect with me on my LinkedIn or look at my search on my homepage.